Just to kind of transition you back, I'd like to begin by telling a little story because I really think that it's exchanges like this that warm our heart and remind us of why we work with these darling little children. So just take a moment to imagine whether an exchange such as this might happen in your school. A little girl was talking to her teacher about whales. The teacher said it was physically impossible for a whale to swallow a human, because even though it was a very large mammal, its throat was very small. The little girl stated that Jonah was swallowed by a whale. Irritated, the teacher reiterated that a whale could not swallow a human. It was physically impossible. The little girl said, "When I get to heaven, I'm going to ask Jonah." The teacher asked, "What if Jonah went to hell?" She said, "Then you ask him." It should happen. Oh, they're quick. They're quick, these kids. Oh my goodness. That's why I love them, I tell you. I remember we started this program called CREW. It was about character, respect, empathy, and wisdom, and really working to develop those characteristics among our kids. And what we did is we invited the students who were on my crew, and I named it, because in middle school you got to make it cool, or it's like, not where kids want to be. So I had my crew, and in each grade, I worked with students to talk about people who were in the community and who had great character. And who could we invite in to speak from the Project Wisdom little message manual to our whole school and really start our day off with a positive message. And so the kids, I would meet with them once a week. Now, as the principal, I met with the kids. In the 6th grade, I had 70 kids in CREW who would meet with me, and because they just want to be with the principal, right, in 6th grade and everything. 7th grade, a little less, 8th grade, a little less, but the kids who were in there really meant a lot, and it was a great opportunity to reflect on who do you believe has great character. And the kids would say, Oprah, or they'd say, even some said Lady Gaga, and I said, why? Because she really believes in being herself. And it was a great opportunity to hear from kids, what they see as the values exemplified by people. And the kids had a chance to invite in people from the larger or the local community and they would greet the kids, they would greet the guests, they did the whole thing. So when I was meeting with one of my groups of students, the little boy came up and said, "Dr. Severns, I'd like to invite my grandpa." I said, "Really?" "Yes, because he is someone who really I respect, and he demonstrates all of the positive values that we talk about." I said, "Yeah." "Well, why is that?" He said, "He was a Vietnam veterinarian." I didn't even realize that there were Vietnam veterinarians. I'm sure animals got killed sometimes, but I just love what kids say because they're just so stinking cute. So anyway, so we took a look at this issue of initiative fatigue. I think sometimes in our interest, in our urgency to really make the district better and good, we say, let's do this and this and this and this, and then there becomes this feeling of learned helplessness. Oh, forget it, it's just too much. And I think we always have to make sure that people have a realistic expectation for success. One of the things that I always did when I worked with students as a teacher is I always wanted my kids to believe that if I try hard, I have a shot at succeeding. That was my whole job, was to keep kids in the game. Do you believe that you can be successful? And for the superintendents with whom you work, they want to be successful. They don't have much of the protection that they had in the past. And so in their efforts to work toward those board goals, I think what's very important is to really think about what is it you're asking of that person to lead, right? And how do those fit in terms of your core mission and what your school and your district is really about. And it might involve kind of paring down some of the things that you're looking to achieve. Even if they have merit, psychologically people kind of disconnect because they think, oh, it's just too much. This load is just too heavy. How can you focus on what really matters the most? And what does matter the most? Well, Doug Reeves says if you're going to prioritize and pick, you should select issues that have impact and leverage. So let's just think about that for a moment. Impact. So when a meteor comes down and hits the earth, it has impact. It goes deep. What is it that makes a deep, meaningful difference in the outcomes that you have for kids? Leverage is the issue where it affects other areas. So, for example, if you're working in a district and you have a real focus on writing, districts that focus on writing often find that your scores improve in literacy, in science, and in math, right? And so, when you select an area on which to focus, my suggestion is if you've got to pare down the list, select issues or items that have impact, it's going to make a big difference, and leverage. It's going to be able to elicit for you positive outcomes across the board. And when you identify those areas, put them together into SMART goals. So that idea is SMART goals. They are specific, measurable, attainable, results-oriented, and time-bound. And what I did in the middle school, we would study our data. We'd find the areas in which students were struggling. And we'd say, okay, what's our baseline? All right, what's our target? And what are our actions? Who's going to be responsible? And when will those actions take place? What is it we're working toward? And so in our middle school, every PLC and every interdisciplinary team had a SMART goal where they were focused, they were working in focused and deliberate ways to improve student outcomes in areas that we found students were low. And when we were selecting areas to work on, we didn't pick very narrow, fine areas. For example, in mathematics, we're going to work on probability, because a focus on probability is going to affect only that narrow area. So what we looked at, for example, is problem-solving strategies, or we looked at writing, even in math. So as an interdisciplinary team, although you teach science, social studies, math, and language arts, we may all agree that what we're going to do is we're going to take turns over the course of the school year to give kids a text to read, for example, and to write about their understandings. And we're going to make it pertinent to our own content area, but we're going to focus on writing. We're even going to agree on a common rubric. We're even going to agree that we're going to look at the student products and say, well, what are our kids producing? And so this became the kind of work that teams started to do in their common planning time. And one of the things that I did in redesigning the master schedule is I built common planning time into the day. So that on A days, my interdisciplinary teams met, that's math, science, social studies, and language arts, and on a B day, our PLCs met. So that's the teachers who all teach the same content areas. So now when we all teach the same content areas, we can work to agree on what Dufour says are the most important questions. First is, what do we want all kids to know and be able to do? Okay? These are the intended outcomes of this unit. Now we agree. How will we know that they've mastered that? All right, let's ask them this question, and have them do this, okay? And now, what are we going to do about the kids who didn't get it? And what is often the least asked and least answered is, what are we going to do with the kids who already know it? There are children who sit in our classrooms every day who already know the intended outcomes for the lesson. And unless or until we use some formative measure to say, what do you already know about, fill in the blank, then we can tailor the instruction to address kids who already know it, as well as the kids who don't. But it starts with taking the temperature first to find out, what do these kids already know about fractions? It's hard to find a kid who's never met a fraction in 7th grade. So we really don't have to start by saying this is the numerator. A lot of time is lost in classrooms because we tend to believe the tabula rasa theory, that they don't know anything, so we will start from nothing. Many of the kids come in knowing something. How would we begin to know what they know and what we want them to know? And then working together, right, within a school, within a team, within a department, how can we set our goals on something that's meaningful and that we're going to measure along the way? And so, as the principal, I worked on having all of my teachers create SMART goals. And I would give them feedback. Oh, I don't think this is quite ambitious enough. Oh, I think this is, a little, let's develop your plan a little more carefully. So I gave the teachers feedback. And 3 times a year at our faculty meeting, which I renamed a teacher academy, because I wanted to prove that what we really are about is learning, not just listening to the principal talk. One of the most amazing experiences of my professional career was to attend one of our teacher academies, formerly faculty meeting, and to have the beautiful opportunity to sit to the side, literally sit down, as team after team and PLC after PLC stepped forward and said, well, here's our SMART goal. We worked on this. We worked on students' comprehension of informational text. And so we did this plan, and these are our outcomes. And when the teachers shared that, I will tell you, I have never had a faculty meeting where people were so completely attentive. They were genuinely interested in what their colleagues were doing. I invited the superintendent, the assistants, I invited all of the district administrators to come and say, look, this is a way that you can do this work. But they had in their day time to do this work. And when your superintendents, right, are working to, and as a board, looking to put together a schedule, to the degree possible, time during the day to collaborate is the greatest gift that you can give teachers. So the teachers had a lunch, a prep, and a duty period. And in the duty period, that's when I said, you need to be in this room with these folks, right? This is the kind of discussions that you're going to have. But you have a separate prep as well, plus you're going to talk with your colleagues on an A day about what you're teaching the kids who you share, and on a B day with your subject peers, how you measure and monitor student outcomes in this content area. So that was an organizational design that I developed very intentionally. I had to make sure I had places for all the kids to be. And so we had to have enough cyclists. So my point is, if you really think about what you want to accomplish, you need to make sure that the time is there to do the work. For example, when you're looking at contracts, right? And there's the amount of faculty meetings that you can have. One of the greatest gifts that I had was I could meet with my faculty 4 Mondays a month. 4 Mondays a month. And when I've worked with districts and I say, what is your opportunity to address teacher learning or collaboration? And people say to me, we are only allowed to meet once a month. That's really tough. So what can you do? When can you work? And if you work within constraints, and we all do, where can you find some opportunity to do things differently to achieve these goals? We have to just continue to go at it, this relentless pursuit of these outcomes. And to remember that what gets measured gets managed. Whatever it is that you pay attention to in your meeting, that is what will be manifested in the schools. And so what do you monitor, right? What do you ask for? That's what's going to shape the focus of the work that's done in the class. Now, over the course of my career, I've worked with several superintendents. So I've worked with some superintendents that the real measure of effectiveness as a principal was happy parents and pretty bulletin boards. I could do that. You just say yes to every parent, right? You don't have many angry ones. But when you start to say, no, your kid can't go on that trip because he's such a scutch, I can't trust him here, let alone take him anywhere. Right? So, right, when you set up some standards and hold kids, and parents don't always like that, that doesn't mean that's not necessary. I've worked with other superintendents. Here's the focus: measured improvements in student outcomes. That's, and so from the top, right, from the conversations that you have at those board tables, others will learn what matters to you. And it won't be dependent on what you necessarily profess are your values, but what they actually see at the table. And so one of the things, some data that I would encourage you to collect is if you were to look at your board meetings, right? And look at how many minutes you spent on various topics and create a pie chart, what would you find? What % of time do you spend on talking about teaching and learning? What % is about, I don't know, some kind of politics or facilities or sports? What % of, so, I mean, wouldn't this be fascinating? at a board meeting, right? To say, and here's some other data I think we should look at as a community. Here's the pie chart. Here's the percentage of time we spend talking about sports and marching band and extracurriculars. Here's the percent of time we talk about, you know, who hires, what's this, that, or the other thing, or just complaining about the state or whatever. Here's the amount of time we spend talking about establishing ambitious outcomes for our kids, measuring and monitoring teaching. Right? I mean, where are your focus areas? And it's evident. It's evident by what you spend your time on. And I understand that there are many powerful, powerful distractors to that work. But how can we focus on what really matters most? So if we wonder about what then matters the most, perhaps we can glean some important understandings from Doug Reeves' work on the 90-90-90 schools. So what Doug Reeves did is he sought to understand, what do they do in schools where 90% of the kids are in free and reduced meals? 90% of the kids are minority, and 90% are achieving the state standards. He said, we should want to know what they're doing. And so what would we find? He found that they are these 5 things. In schools that are defying the odds, these are what they're doing. First, a laser-like focus on student achievement. That is the core of every conversation. We are about a relentless pursuit of student learning, given all the constraints that kids have. That we focus on clear curriculum choices, meaning more time is spent on reading, writing, and mathematics than on anything else. That in the day, if you look at the percent of time allocated to what we do, we are focusing on reading, writing, and mathematics. And I want to make a strong point here. That doesn't mean that you don't have science and social studies. If there's one thing that I did that I think truly affected our outcomes, is in my school, I made it very clear that social studies teachers were equally accountable to the language arts outcomes, and science teachers were accountable to math. And it wasn't until I did that in a very clear and deliberate way that social studies teachers started to find time to have kids do real reading and real writing in social studies. Because social studies should not be about the regurgitation of a discrete series of facts from the past, right? It should be about understanding. And in fact, the Common Core, in terms of social studies, says kids have to read primary sources, understand these concepts, and write about those understandings. So social studies is a great opportunity to improve your literacy outcomes. And this is my opinion. I'm going to share with you my opinion, Tracey. I believe that social studies is best taught as a literacy course that happens to be about social studies. If every social studies assessment has questions that can be answered on a line this big, you're asking the wrong questions. Because it's not about how many died on which hill and rank order the battles and match it to the general. Who cares? My concern is not whether kids recall how many died at Gettysburg, but whether they can write about why it was a field worth dying on. If we look at our assessments, what do they tell us about what we ask of our kids? Many times, the assessments are very focused on facts, and if we ask knowledge level questions, you will get surface level knowledge. That's it. A huge takeaway from me, a big aha, was also stated in Paul Bambrick-Santoyo's book, that the complexity of the questions that we set before kids is directly related to the depth of the learning. We need to challenge kids with tough questions. What I said in my school, because I believed, I knew, I lived, that what gets measured gets managed, I said in my school, listen, this year, I'm going to collect every assessment that results in a grade. Do you think that changes things?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, it does. Because I found some terrible assessments. I found some assessments that, what color was the character's shirt when he said, really? Is this just a trick? Right? What are the level of assessments? And one of the things that we learned when we looked at the assessments in the special ed classes is that they weren't asking anything of them. Right? The job is to teach them how to think, to infer, to answer these questions. That is what is supposed to make special ed special. Right? In fact, I mean, it was a fascinating, Bob Pasternak, I think was his name, he was presenting about special education in the nation. He said the vast preponderance of our children are SLD, they have a specific learning disability. That means they can learn if and when they're taught in the way that they learn. He said he believes that much of the outcomes that we see for children with special needs, and I would suggest also low-performing populations, is that they suffer not from a disability, but dyspedagogia. That they have been poorly taught. And so I wonder, right, about what's going on in class, right? So we have to have high expectations and teach them how to reach that. When I said to teachers, I'm going to collect every assessment that results in a grade, the assessments improved. Now, I didn't get to read this, but it was fascinating what I found. And so I've said to teachers, here's a way to assess your assessment. If you can use your iPhone to answer every question, you're probably asking the wrong one. Whatever you attend to is what makes a difference. So, here, frequent assessment and multiple opportunities for improvement. Frequent assessment. That in fact, as much as people often bemoan, we test too much. When we use assessments to gain insight into who knows what to what degree, and then we teach them what they didn't know, that's one of the most powerful and impactful strategies that you can use. Testing well and right with timely, constructive feedback for kids is one of the most effective practices that we can use. But if all we do is test and test and test and test, and teachers don't get to look at the results, and kids don't get to understand their results, then it's for nothing. We shouldn't test for testing's sake, but in how we use the results. One of the things that you might, perhaps, I spoke earlier that I was from Mount Olive, and that might be familiar to some because a couple years ago it got a lot of attention when we were the district that eliminated the grade of D. Right? We raised that passing benchmark to 70. And so we instituted a variety of practices to change student success. One of them was this. Anytime a kid got a grade less than a 70, because we wanted mastery, we said that all kids deserve to learn. Anytime a kid got a grade below 70, they got a second shot at the learning. And so when a teacher entered the scores in the grade book, one of the things that happened, this was really an amazing intervention that we set up through Power School, is that every grade below 70 triggered an automatic e-alert to your phone as a parent. So the parent always knew if their child didn't hand something in or this child did very poorly. And then the kid had 3 days for a redemptive opportunity to learn what they didn't learn the first time. Now I'm going to say to you, that's more work. Straight up. That is definitely more work. And when we first instituted the practice, the first person who came to see me was the grievance chair. Right? This is too much work. I said, what is our job? Our job is teaching and learning, right? And so we can't just leave these kids behind. And so if a kid got less than 70, we're going to give them extra support, extra time, extra instruction, extra attention, and we're going to give them a second chance to demonstrate the learning. Because if the assignment or assessment measured something that was worthy, how can we just say, too bad you didn't get it? We've got to go back at that again. And we did. Now some teachers created alternative forms of the same test, or just had them write, like there were all different ways that we did it, and it was more work. So we worked to give teachers time to do that, in some of those team meetings, in some of those PLCs. But what was powerful is that kids learned they had a second chance at the learning. So we read that book, Failure's Not an Option. And we were inspired by Whatever It Takes by DeFore, 2 different books. Now here was the interesting thing. Now let's say you're a kid. One of the things you always have to make sure when you work with kids are the unintended takeaways. So we wanted to make sure that a student would not study for the test, come in, check it out, fail it, because they could come back in a couple days and get a 96. Because, right, there's always an opportunity for kids to take advantage of something. And so here was the rule. If you went back and took the test and got a 96, the score in the grade book was 70. That's the highest score that you could get. That was passing, right on the border. But you see, we wanted to make sure that the learning was this. It's best to do it well and right the first time. But if you don't get it, we're going to give you some extra time and instruction, and we're going to give you a second chance to take that assessment. And if you get 100, you still get a 70, because we didn't want kids to come in, as I said, and take advantage of that opportunity. Because if you took the test the first time and got an 86, then you shouldn't come in and be able to do better than her. That was just one of the things that we did. But we started with this. The superintendent said, your charge is this, to raise the passing benchmarks and ensure that more students pass, fewer students fail, and that we maintain rigorous standards. So I said to myself as a principal, holy crow, what am I going to do to make this happen? We got together and said, what are we going to do? And if you were to look at the time on the Mount Olive Middle School website, I had an action plan all around getting rid of the D. And we went after the 3 things that I believe contribute to student failure. 1, attitude. 2, ability. 3, attendance. Let's think about it. Do you have kids in your school who are able but not willing? Do you have kids who are willing but not able? And you have kids who just don't come to school. And so we sat down and we said, we believe that these 3 things, these were my hypotheses. So if someone was to say, why do you think kids fail classes? I'd say, I've got kids who are reluctant learners because of their family, because they're in a power struggle issue, because they're disaffected, whatever. They are able, bright kids, but they fail because they won't do school. What are we going to do to go after them? How can we capture them? Here's what we did. We set up a lunch and learn program. I said, until you start making good decisions, I'll make decisions for you. You don't get to eat with your friends. And when you start passing your classes, you're back with your friends. And that didn't work for all kids, but it worked for a lot. Then we had kids who were willing but unable. What do they need from us? They need to be taught. So how can we make sure the right kids are in homework club, not just the kids who volunteer? Who needs to be here, and are we going after them? We paid attention to every kid who was failing. And what about the kids who don't come to school? We got those parents in, or we sent them, we went after those kids to the degree that we can. Even when I set up incentives, anything I could do to get them to come to school. Because if you don't come to school, you're at a serious disadvantage. So we started with a challenge. I mean, think about it. What would you do if you said, in this district, 65% isn't mastery. We're going to raise it to 70. Then you've got to also elevate the supports. What are we doing for the kids? What are we doing for the parents? What are we doing for the teachers? How are we going to celebrate the outcomes? We did a variety of things, one of which is we made achievement count. We said to kids, if you improve your ASK score by 15 points or more, you're going to be invited to an achievement breakfast celebration. We're going to celebrate your success, because you know what we realized for a kid? There's nothing different for that kid between getting a 235 or a 255. But it mattered to me. You remember what I said to you? My superintendent evaluated me on advanced proficient. So for a kid, it didn't matter, 245, 255. For me, it's my, well, it's my out, right? So I said, I want to cause them to push on that pedal as hard as they can, build the stamina, and do the best they can. But currently, we realized there was no incentive to do the best that you could on a really hard test. So I met with all the kids. I'm like, all right, we're having a new thing, achievement breakfast celebration. We made up certificates. We invited parents. And one of the parents came up to me in the cafeteria and said, Dr. Severns, I just want to tell you something. This is the first academic recognition Kyle has had since kindergarten. Because although he's special ed, And while he's still partially proficient, by God, he's 15 points higher than he used to be. But no one paid attention to improvement. He's still partially proficient, but he's better. And so what does Kyle believe? He might be better able to see success breeds success. And whatever you pay attention to is what's going to matter. My whole school shifted our discipline focus to catch them being good. Catch them being good every day in every way that you can. The whole culture shifted to earning positive points, positive points. I would say their name, they'd come down. We had citizenship and positive point for whatever you celebrate, right? That's what shapes the culture and it changes the capacity. What do you pay attention to in your school? I'll give you one other example of what we did to change the outcomes for our kids, because I intended to achieve this challenge set forth. The other thing is I met with every student who was failing, and we set up a contract for success. I had the guidance counselor, the parent, and the student. I met in my office with every student who was failing, and we would say, here are the parent responsibilities, the teacher responsibilities, and the student responsibility, and I had them sign their name. And do you know what's astounding? Do you know how few students know how to sign their name in cursive? It's like, this is a lost art. Cursive is a lost art, right? I would teach them how to write their name in cursive. But here was my point. I said to them, now you listen to me. You're sitting with me right now in this office. I have 1,200 kids, and I am sitting here with you. What does that say to you? You matter to me. You matter to, and the least that you can do is step up to, and I'm going to be paying attention. And when we paid attention to those kids, many of them passed. When before they had passed, they had failed unnoticed. You can do things. You can do anything, and with any kind of kid. It's just what you decide to go after. So as board members, you could say, what are we doing to incent our kids, perhaps, right, to come to school? You can go the consequence route, sure. But I have done so much better catching bees with honey. You really, what do we pay attention to in our school? And when we gave kids more chances, more kids passed. The data was amazing. So if we're taking a look at something that we want to do better, let's say get more kids to attend, or raise the scores of certain kids, or get underrepresented groups into the AP tests, or we talked about at lunch, getting more kids to take the PSATs, let's say, right? And so we talked about it at lunch, that he was saying that when he asked about the data, about how many kids take the PSAT, found that very few kids took it. He said, well, what if we paid for it as a district and found that they could and they did, and that changes things, right? So if we have a goal to have more kids believe and be ready to be college ready, and so this is something we want to achieve, we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to do that? And so I would say, well, what's the plan for doing that? And we don't have one, isn't really good enough, right? So what will we do? I wouldn't say what it needs to be, but what strategy will we use? There needs to be something. And I would say that in trying to ride that line, I wouldn't say what it has to be, but what are we doing to increase the likelihood that we're going to achieve our goals? And nothing just isn't a good enough answer. I wouldn't say that you, again, need to tell them what that needs to be, but that there is a plan is non-negotiable. That's in my opinion. Improvement. In many schools, we don't necessarily acknowledge or reward improvement, right? We look at just mastery, but there's a lot of kids who, for example, in one of the other schools in our district, the achievement breakfast celebration was only for kids who scored advanced proficient. And so right away, there's a lot of kids who are gonna say, I can't do that, so I'm out. But I wanted every child to try. And so everyone can improve. And if you're topped out at 300, well, you're going to come to the breakfast too, because you could be advanced, proficient, or improve. But when we really think about how this is going to be interpreted and received by the kids, we can say, well, what about improvement? I mean, honor rolls tend to be about who get A's, right, or A, like whatever. But what about an improvement roll? what would happen in terms of changing this culture if we really look at creating an improvement role? As a matter of fact, I just thought of that. I really like that idea. So somebody tell me, when you're like, Tracey, we're doing that. Yes, Ken?
Well, I think everything that's come up so far, any idea that you have generated here for board members, it really comes down to asking the question, not what are you doing or what are we doing, what could we do? What's the realm of the possible? So everything that's coming out of here, and I've heard a lot during lunch as we were networking, what can we do now? And I think that's what you put back to your superintendent and their administrative team. What can we do to recognize students, all students, and their academic achievements? That's all you start, and it's a conversation, which goes from, instead of the politics or the band, it goes to student achievement.
Yes.
And instead of putting anyone on the spot, it actually becomes part of the fabric of your discussion every time. What else can we do?
Yes.
And it builds off all these topics that you're bringing about. And I think that's where you'll start without your superintendent and the team going, oh, now what? They went to a workshop and here's a honeydew list. No. It really just refocuses. And we have a board that does just that. Every time we get ourselves caught up somewhere else, we say, okay, what are we doing for the students?
Great.
And that's how we get that question going.
Perfect. And sometimes you need kind of a visual or even some reminder of are we focusing on the right stuff? That's perfect. So in terms of the 90-90-90 schools, the number 4 is an emphasis on nonfiction writing. Nonfiction writing. Because that helps children understand any content that they're learning. And so in our school, one of the things that I did is to work very hard to help every teacher understand that yes, you are a writing teacher. You are a reading teacher. And we're going to work together on helping you understand how to develop good prompts and score students' writing. But please don't tell me I just teach phys ed or I just teach art. Because in every content area, you can develop deep understandings by causing kids to really read and really write about their understandings. And again, we shifted our focus to the things that mattered most. So if you were to look at the SMART goals in my school, you would see that much of the focus was on nonfiction writing and nonfiction reading. And the final one is that in our PLCs and in our teams, we would do collaborative scoring of student work. One of the things that remains often unnamed and unnoticed is that with the best of intention, teachers often bring different criteria to judging the work. And when we put on the table, let's take a look at the student work. How would you score that? How would you? Oh, I gave it a below expectations. Oh, I gave it above because, and we had that conversation, we set up common criteria. That truly serves the kids well because now we all teach this or we all teach them. What is the common set of criteria that we're bringing? And let's actually do that on the student work. And it's a great way to spend the time together because you're getting work done. Again, if we focus on growth, if we take a look at a student's work and we use a rubric, the special needs student may be very, very low because they have these disabilities. But that doesn't mean that we don't seek to make them better at it. So if we give them some feedback, it's focus. So the next time that you do this writing, do this. Whatever that specific feedback would be, that's what then we look to see if that is improved in the next time. So the outcome may not be all the highest score on the rubric, but if we can move kids along the rubric, right? I think that's what our work is to do with special ed students. And then the question point is, how do we use that as a grade? So we don't necessarily want to use that to bring the kids' grade down, but we're using it not necessarily as a grade. See, I think one of the confusing points is assessments and grades. Not every assessment has to result in a grade, right? And so when we assess, we seek to understand how well are you doing so far. So assessments can be done at the beginning, at the middle, at the end, and maybe with the special needs students, you're looking at the progress over time. And if you think more flexibly about grading as progress, it could be possible that a child with special needs really could make greater progress even than someone who was without special needs and performing in a mid-range, let's say. So I think that sometimes we get bogged down. What distracts us from good instructional practices is a sense that we have to do grades, and I understand that. And that becomes truly another challenge when we look at children with special needs, because If you look at the data for children with special needs, one of the things that I found is that as you move children from more restrictive settings to more included settings, two things tend to happen. Their scores rise, their scores rise and their grades fall. So let's think about that. So if I teach, you guys are in my resource center, right? And so we work together. I know you try really hard and you've all, right? So in my resource center, if you tend to look at grades for resource center kids, what kind of grades do kids often get? B's, A's?
That's right.
Okay. Well, often in resource center with parents who are kind of really monitoring, and I understand your disabilities, right? And I really support you, so I don't want to discourage you, so you get B's in my class in resource. Now, what has happened at times is now we think you're ready to go to the in-class setting. Her grades may drop, but often her scores rise. You see what I'm saying? So what I have found is in New Jersey, ask scores rise, and the marking period grades fall. What do parents often attend to more closely? Marking period grades. So we have to help them, right? Understand, well, let's take a look at this, because what does it really mean if you have straight A's and you're partially proficient? I mean, one of the things that we often don't kind of triangulate is these different data sources. And I've had parents come to me, I don't understand. My child is now being recommended for basic skills, and look at the report card. She got all A's in math. So, I mean, how do we reconcile that? By what measure are we doing? And many times, grades are much more shaped by compliance, of whether you hand everything in, than really what you're achieving. So, the 90-90-90 school, when we look to establish our SMART goals, we want to pick areas that are going to have impact and leverage, that are going to make a big difference. So as a district leader, when I was putting this presentation together, I really sought to help you think about your role, from your vantage point. What is your role as a district leader? So Marzano and Waters talk about this idea of simultaneously loose and tight. And that really comes down to many of the questions you've asked me as board members. What do I kind of force, so to speak, or press on, and where do I kind of pull back and let remain loose and have some choice? So the idea of simultaneously loose, tight leadership is characterized by defined authority. So we would articulate clear, non-discretionary goals. You might say, so we'd like to decide that all of the teachers are going to have SMART goals, let's say. But what they focus them on is really up to them. So in your district, where are there areas that are defined, they're tight, everyone does this, and where are there areas that are loose? So if we look at those goals, we provide strategies for achieving the goals and then indicators that are going to be used to monitor those goals. So a question that I have for you is, what's tight in your district? What 3 things throughout the district do you think people understand are non-negotiables? What things in your district do you think that, regardless of who you would walk up to and ask a question, they would say, we have choice here, we can do this, right? But this is tight. Everyone does this. What are the non-discretionary priorities that must be observed in every school? So first, think about that yourself. And then if you're here with someone from your district, compare it to theirs. But don't do it together, because I think it'll be interesting to find whether their ideas of what's tight in your district are the same as your ideas of what's tight in the district. So first, think about what are the non-discretionary priorities, the things that every school is doing this. This is tight in our district. So security, right, that's a great example. A school cannot decide, we are just an open school. We keep all of our doors open. That's like, no, right? And we're going to have these kinds of procedures to make sure that the right people are allowed in the school. That's an excellent example. You have attendance, and tight attendance, and you pay attention to the attendance of of the teachers as well as the students, or is it really the students, or? The students, student policy, very good. So we pay close attention to student attendance, yes. And so what's interesting to notice is what are we really all about? And are those areas that are really tight aligned to the priority? Now I have, again, been in some districts where what is managed most is how how frequently the bulletin boards are changed. Or when the plan books, right? And so, you sometimes can chase the wrong things at times, right? So really take a look at what you're paying attention to. And it's interesting because I would bet that where you are, right, safety, everyone would agree on that. But in some places, for example, with the example that she provided, the common assessments, would everyone agree on that? I'm not so sure. So as a board member, so I really thought about this. What is your role? I believe it really is focusing on asking the right questions, on the monitoring component. You are not the doers, not the dictators, right? You can ask questions like, how are teachers organized into teams? And if the answer is they're not, say, what could we do, right? What could be done to make that possible? How are teachers given time to collaborate? Yeah. Well, some of them go to happy hour together on Friday. Maybe not so much. It's such a good idea. How are the work of teams monitored? You don't need to be in a place where you're saying, we want to collect and see all the SMART goals. But you might want to say, how are goals established and monitored in the school, right? What are the practices that we want to see done? Any school I have ever spoken with said, to what do you attribute your success? None have ever said it's these programs. They say to me, it's these practices. We have a relentless pursuit of student achievement, and in that pursuit, here's what we do. We have unit assessments. At the end of every unit assessment, we take a look at how kids are doing. And this data is analyzed by the teachers in the PLCs, and then here's what we do with the kids who didn't get it. And the principal is looking at all of that data. And the principal is sharing that with the superintendent, and it flows up and it flows down, but we're looking at our student outcomes. And we're walking through the classrooms, and we're seeing how does the data that we're getting back relate to what we're seeing happening in the classrooms? How are the results of common assessments being used by the team? Now, you might ask that question, and they say, we don't have common assessments. Our teachers believe, that what we believe in here is all about academic freedom. Okay? Well, what do we tend to find? Because when you have schools that really believe in academic freedom, right, this is what I do with my kids, well then you rob yourself of that opportunity to really leverage best practices, because when we agree what all kids should know and be able to do, and we agree on how we will know that, and then we look at the student outcomes, I can again, remember, go back to saying, how did you do that? And the best practices come from not what I say I do really well, but what the data speaks to as being very effective. How are schools providing systematic intervention and enrichment? So what are we doing with the kids? How are we using our ITI process to really look to see how kids are doing if they're struggling? That's the kind of questions I would focus on. How are we doing this? And if it's like, well, we don't do that, and we don't do this, and we don't, well, how might those decisions be contributing to our outcome? I think you're so right, because you can keep asking, how are you doing this, how are you doing this, but when you reflect on how are we making this possible, that's a powerful question. I think one of the things that often it comes down to is, what are your beliefs about about professional learning? Because I've worked with some boards who think that this is something teachers should do on their own time, or they're already professionals, they should already know. I mean, even my hairdresser goes to regular professional learning, right? I mean, so we should want teachers to be constantly learning. So how do we make that possible?
Tracey, if that board member just said that at the end of today's session, and I'm talking from a superintendent, I think you accomplished your goal. because your goal of planning this workshop, because it's really educating board members to know what the expectations are, and then to support those resources in the budget, because traditionally, when we talk about differentiated instruction and adding resources, or being a more inclusive environment, or having more staff or more resources and using technology, that's all money. And
Right.
traditionally, board members look at that and say, why do we need that? So I think that this whole day of developing a board members' philosophy of understanding what does the new educational reform system look like?
Yes.
And what do we need to do that? If a board member can say that at the end of the day, yes.
Yes.
You know, that's what I would like, you know, my board to be
Perfect.
supporting and saying, we understand. Sounds good.
So, should we just go home?
Yeah.
That was not a plan.
No. Great, that's really exciting. And what is effective monitoring? I mean, for me, there's always two things. There's what we do and how we do it. And the spirit in which you work is so important. Is so important. I have experienced the benefit of wonderful board members, and I have suffered some terrible, honestly. Because I would sit and just answer email. What about this? What about this? What about this? What about? So I can sit there and just look to, you know, attend to all of the wins, the interest, you know, all of these things, which were often such distractors. Like, look over here, look over here. I wanted to focus on teaching and learning, and I wanted board members to say to me, how much of your time in the week do you spend in classrooms? Not sitting there answering all of our, you know, various requests in the moment and on the spot. Because I could do that. But I really think you should want me to know what's going on in the classrooms. And so monitoring should be frequent. It should be done frequently on everyone's part, both the student assessment by the teachers, the leader of what's going on in the classrooms, our district leaders of what's going on in the buildings, and the board of what's going on throughout the district. And focused on the action of adults, not just the student outcomes. So what do I mean by that? Again, it's the practices. It's what are we doing to achieve our outcomes? What are our focused areas of attention? What are the adults doing? How do we have our RTI teams set up so we support our students? And is it constructive? We can approach any task in one of two very different ways. Is it a witch hunt or a treasure hunt? I mean, there are times that people seem to work in this spirit of, we want to catch them to do something. We want to catch them doing something wrong. The spirit in which we do the work, I think, is really, really important. So, and communication is key. I mean, that's really what we're talking about, is communication. And leaders throughout the district, I think, should speak with one voice and listen with both ears. One of the things I know for sure is that when you become a school board member, everyone wants to tell you what they think. You could be on the elliptical in the gym, be like, oh, can't I just even exercise? You're picking out, you know, eggplant at the grocery store and be, you know what I think about that teacher, about that program, about, yes, I really, it is often a thankless job that you are just tormented constantly by people in the community with their concerns, their gripes, their whatever. And so framing that for people, I think, is challenging. But as district leaders, it is important to listen, but always remember that it comes to you through a certain, I'll say, filter or lens. And communication then must be clear, constant, consistent, and congruous, right? So your actions truly reflect your words. So let's do a little communication audit. We talked about the fact that you have data in your districts. Much of it really could be used to represent success. And I love what Jerry and we were talking about, just that idea of how you can change culture and capacity through success, right? And you were talking about a school that uses articles from the paper, right? Where the kids have succeeded from winning a spelling bee to a basketball tournament. And you can take those articles, laminate them, and hang them up in the lobby, which shows, look at all of the ways our students are successful in every way that they come, from the robotics competition to a sports competition. And what you celebrate by doing that, right, can really influence and shape the culture. So, the communication systems that you use to get out your story What do you have? What systems ensure that priorities are addressed in each school? You think about this, how do you monitor, what do you monitor in your district? What questions do you ask? How do you decide how to allocate your resources? For example, we talked about the technology. Where is the technology? Where is there a lot of it, a very little of it? What does that reflect? What do you celebrate? What do you pay attention to? What are you willing to confront, and what do you model? So I'd like you to take a little bit of time to talk at your table about this idea of a communication audit. And how might you be able to bring this conversation back to your district so that maybe, over time you address a few of these questions and you say, what are our focus of communication? So take a little time and do a communication audit.
Do you think that bringing some of these questions to your board might be a worthwhile discussion? Right? This could really lead to some insight into, how are we working and how does this influence others?
So I think that this is a great resource that you can use, kind of to do this idea of a communication audit. So some people ask me, okay, well, what should we do after this? Well, to answer that question, what can you do? First, is I invite you to be curious, is to learn to ask questions of the data and to seek answers, and to guide with those questions, and then to do something with the data. Use it to determine the district's priorities for professional development and the allocation of resources. I think one of the things that concerns me is sometimes professional development priorities are established by doing a needs assessment where we send out SurveyMonkey to all the teachers and say, what do you think you need to learn? Sometimes the problem is we don't know what we don't know. But what does the data tell us? If the data tells us that our kids really struggle in these areas, in math or in literacy or in science, how should that inform our PD? Right? And so when I would do walkthroughs in classrooms, and I would see that sometimes the teachers were struggling to help kids know how to cite text evidence or to do close reading, that would form the basis of our next PD session. So it would come up from those real walkthroughs of being in the classrooms, observing the dynamics, also of the outcomes for the students. So when we would look at student outcomes and we saw that kids really struggle with writing, we said, what can we do to improve their writing? And how can we work together to make that happen? And to respect the data. I think to be judicious in the way that the data is handled and shared. One of the things that often gets in the way of using data is that it's scary to people. It's very scary to put your truth on the table in that way, to really take a look at the data and say, well, what does this mean for me then as a teacher, or as a principal, as a superintendent, or as a board member who's been a part of these decisions that has led us to this day and to these outcomes. So I think it's very important to balance the need between confidentiality and transparency. Some people say, we want to see how every teacher's doing with every kid. And I think you have to decide, do we really need to go to that level, right? Or do we need to ask questions about what are we doing to monitor the performance and the progress for each kid in each class? That's a different, you kind of are pulling up a little bit. So in that board role, you kind of stay at 10,000 feet. Your job is not to kind of get all the way down into the classroom. And how can you really balance those interests? So and does it really matter? Well, one of the things that I think is sobering is when you look at Marzano and Strong's research, they suggest that 1 year with an ineffective teacher takes 3 consecutive years of greatness to catch up. And that for me is a very sobering statistic because I've worked in all kinds of districts, right? With all kinds of districts from A to J. And I wouldn't bet my pension on the likelihood of any kid getting 3 consecutive years of excellence. And so what can we do to increase the likelihood that every year we are attending to every child and seeking to move them forward so that truly they have that shot. They have a realistic expectation for success that I can graduate and I can pursue college or career of my choice. before we go to this and have some discussion, I would just like to point out what I included in the resources that I provide on page 36 and 37 is sometimes people have said to me, well, what can we do to set up a school improvement plan? And I don't mean, I mean just some focused attempt to improve a particular area. And so I've offered a resource that you can take with you. And the first on page 36 came from a district where I was working with them to improve their outcomes. We took a look at their vision, their problems, their goals, their indicators for success, and the resources. So then we can begin to say, well, what can we do to improve our outcomes? And then the overall process. So if you were to say to me, well, how are we really supposed to do the work? Although it's in somewhat general terms, it kind of gives an overview of how I would begin and how I would move through that school improvement process.